What happens when one of comedy's most beloved legends walks into what should be a routine late-night talk show appearance, only to find himself blindsided by a host with a hidden agenda? Tonight, we're diving deep into the shocking confrontation that had Steve Martin storming off Jimmy Kimmel's set, leaving audiences stunned and wondering what really went down behind those bright studio lights. This wasn't your typical celebrity interview gone wrong. This was a calculated ambush that revealed the darker side of late-night television. If you want to see how far some hosts will go for ratings, and why even the most professional entertainers have their breaking point, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me which late-night host you think handles interviews the best. Now let's get into this explosive story. The Tonight Show with Jimmy Kimmel was running its usual Tuesday night schedule when Steve Martin arrived at the studio. As one of the most respected figures in entertainment, Martin had been a guest on countless talk shows over his decades-long career. He knew the drill: shake hands with the host, sit down, promote whatever project brought him there, share a few laughs, and head home. What he didn't expect was that Jimmy Kimmel had spent weeks preparing what he called his most important interview ever. Martin settled into the guest chair with his characteristic easygoing demeanor, adjusting his suit, jacket, as the studio audience applauded. Kimmel sat across from him, that familiar grin plastered across his face. But there was something different in his eyes tonight, something that Martin couldn't quite place. "Steve Martin, ladies and gentlemen," Kimmel announced as the applause died down. "You know, Steve, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a really long time. I mean, really long time." Martin smiled politely. "Well, I'm happy to be here, Jimmy. Always enjoy coming on the show." "Do you?" Kimmel leaned forward slightly, his tone shifting just enough to make Martin's eyebrows raise a fraction. "Because I've been doing some research, and I'm curious about something. You've been on this show, what, 6 times over the years? Something like that? Yes? 6 times. And every single time, you give these perfectly polished answers, these carefully crafted responses that sound great, but don't really say anything at all." Kimmel's smile never wavered, but his words carried an edge that made the studio audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. Martin maintained his composure, though his voice took on a slightly cooler tone. "I'm not sure I follow, Jimmy." "I think you do. See, I've noticed something about you, Steve. You're always on, always performing, always hiding behind this character you've created." Kimmel gestured broadly, as if addressing the entire audience. "But tonight, I want to talk to the real Steve Martin. Not the comedian, not the actor, not the banjo-playing entertainer. I want to talk to the man." The studio had grown noticeably quieter. Martin shifted in his chair, his professional smile beginning to show cracks around the edges. "Jimmy, I'm not sure what you're getting at here. I came on the show to talk about my new book, and I'm happy to discuss my career, but I'm not sure what you mean by hiding behind a character, your book, right? Let's talk about your book." Kimmel reached under his desk and pulled out a copy. But instead of the usual promotional praise, he opened it to a page marked with a yellow sticky note. Page 47. "You write about growing up, about your relationship with your father. Pretty heavy stuff. But here's what I find interesting. You spend 3 paragraphs describing this traumatic childhood experience, and then you immediately follow it with a joke. Classic deflection." Martin's jaw tightened slightly. "That's called storytelling, Jimmy. Finding humor in difficult situations is how many people cope, or it's how they avoid dealing with real emotions." Kimmel closed the book with a sharp snap. "Tell me, Steve, when was the last time you had a genuine conversation with someone, without turning it into material for your next routine?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Martin felt something shift inside him. This wasn't an interview anymore. This was an interrogation disguised as entertainment. He could see the camera operators leaning in closer, the audience holding their collective breath, waiting to see how he would respond to what was clearly a calculated attack. "Jimmy, I have to say, this is a pretty unusual approach for a talk show," Martin said, his voice steady but carrying a warning that anyone who knew him well would recognize. "I'm not sure what you're hoping to accomplish here, but if you want to have a conversation about my work, I'm happy to do that. If you want to play amateur psychologist, maybe you should have booked someone else." Kimmel leaned back in his chair, that infuriating grin spreading wider across his face. "Oh, but that's exactly what I'm talking about, Steve, right there. Someone challenges you, tries to get past the surface, and what do? You deflect with sarcasm and try to turn it back on me. It's like watching a masterclass in emotional avoidance." Emotional avoidance. Martin's voice rose slightly, the first crack in his composed facade. "Jimmy, you invited me on your show. I didn't ask to be here. I didn't ask to be psychoanalyzed by someone whose biggest claim to fame is reading mean tweets on television." The audience gasped audibly at that, and Kimmel's eyes flashed with something that looked almost like satisfaction. "There we go. Now we're getting somewhere." You see, folks, he turned to address the camera directly. This is what happens when you strip away the carefully constructed persona. The real Steve Martin is actually pretty arrogant, isn't he? Martin stood up abruptly, his hands clenched at his sides. "I'm sorry. What did you just say?" "I said you're arrogant and defensive, and you've spent so many years hiding behind your comedy that you've forgotten how to be a real person." Kimmel was clearly enjoying himself now, feeding off the tension he had created. "You want to know what I think? I think you've been coasting. On your reputation for decades, when was the last time you actually took a real risk? When was the last time you did anything that wasn't calculated to maintain your image as the lovable, quirky comedian?" "You know what, Jimmy?" Martin's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more weight than if he had been shouting. "I've been in this business for 50 years. 50 years. I've written books, starred in movies, recorded albums, won awards, and built a career that most people in this industry would kill for. And I did it by being professional, by respecting my craft, and by treating people with dignity, something you clearly know nothing about." "Professional," Kimmel repeated, tasting the word like it was something distasteful. "Is that what you call it when you show up to interviews with the same tired anecdotes? The same rehearsed stories you've been telling for 20 years? Is that what you call it when you refuse to let anyone see who you really are?" "Who I really am?" Martin's composure was completely gone now, his face flushed with anger. "Who I really am is someone who respects the people who pay to see my work. Who I really am is someone who doesn't ambush guests on television for cheap ratings. Who I really am is someone who understands that entertainment is supposed to make people feel better. But that's just it, isn't it, Steve? You've confused entertaining people with hiding from them. You've made a career out of being the guy who never lets anyone get too close, who never shows any real vulnerability, who always has a punchline ready to deflect any serious moment." Kimmel was relentless now, pressing his advantage like a prosecutor going in for the kill. "Even now, when I'm trying to have an honest conversation with you, you can't help but turn it into a lecture about professionalism and respect." Laughed, but there was no humor in it. "An honest conversation. Is that what you call this?" "Jimmy, this isn't honest. This is cruel. This is you deciding that you know better than I do how I should live my life, how I should present myself, how I should feel about my own experiences. And you're doing it in front of millions of people for your own ego." "My ego?" Kimmel's voice took on a mocking tone. "That's rich, coming from someone who's spent his entire career making everything about himself. Tell me, Steve, when you're up there on stage, talking about your life, your experiences, your observations, do you ever think about the audience? Or are they just there to validate your cleverness?" The studio had become completely silent, except for the hum of the cameras and the air conditioning. Martin stood there for a long moment, staring at Kimmel with a mixture of disgust and something that looked almost like pity. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the weight of decades of experience and wisdom. "You know what the difference is between us, Jimmy? When I get up on stage, when I write a book, when I make a movie, I'm trying to give people something. I'm trying to make them laugh, or think, or feel less alone in the world. You, on the other hand, you're trying to take my dignity, my privacy, my right to present myself the way I choose, and you're doing it because you think it will make good television." "Maybe it will," Kimmel shot back, his mask finally slipping to reveal the calculating ambition underneath. "Maybe people are tired of the same old celebrity interview format. Maybe they want to see what happens when someone actually pushes back, when someone refuses to play along with the carefully scripted dance that passes for conversation on these shows. Then you should have told me that's what you were planning," Martin replied, his voice gaining strength. "You should have been honest about your intentions, instead of pretending this was going to be a normal interview. But you couldn't do that, could you? Because you knew I never would have agreed to be part of your little experiment in public humiliation." Kimmel shrugged, seemingly unbothered by the accusation. Would you have? Would Steve Martin, the consummate professional, have agreed to an interview where he might actually have to deal with some uncomfortable questions, where he might have to show the audience something real instead of another polished performance? "You're damn right I wouldn't have," Martin said, his anger flaring again. "Because there's a difference between being real and being exploited. There's a difference between honest conversation and public therapy. And there's a difference between entertainment and cruelty." Cruelty? Kimmel's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Steve, we're having a conversation. I'm asking you questions. If that feels like cruelty to you, maybe that says more about you than it does about me. Maybe the problem is that you've gotten so comfortable in your little bubble of controlled interactions that any genuine human connection feels like an attack." Martin's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of containing decades of professionalism that were screaming at him to walk away from this disaster. "Jimmy, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I have done thousands of interviews in my career. I have dealt with hostile journalists, aggressive paparazzi, and critics who made their living tearing apart everything I created. But what you're doing right now, this isn't journalism. This isn't entertainment. This is just sadism dressed up as insight. Sadism." Kimmel's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "Because I'm asking you to be honest for 5 minutes? Because I'm not content to sit here and let you run through your greatest hits one more time? You know what I think is sad, Steve? I think it's sad that a man with your talent, with your intelligence, with your experience, is so terrified of being seen as anything other than perfect that he can't have a real conversation with another human being. Perfect." Martin's voice cracked slightly, and for the first time, genuine hurt flickered across his face. "Jimmy, you don't know anything about me. You don't know about the nights I've stayed awake questioning every choice I've made, every word I've said on stage, every performance that didn't land the way I hoped it would. You don't know about the relationships I've struggled with, the doubts I've had, the times I've felt like a fraud standing in front of an audience. But you know what the difference is between us? I don't put that on display for strangers to consume." "Why not?" Kimmel pressed, sensing weakness and moving in for what he clearly hoped would be the kill shot. "Why is vulnerability something to be ashamed of? Because it's not about shame, you idiot," Martin snapped, his carefully maintained composure finally shattering completely. "It's about boundaries. It's about recognizing that not every moment of pain needs to become content. It's about understanding that there's a difference between sharing your humanity and bleeding for applause. Some things are private, Jimmy. Some things are sacred. Some things don't belong to the audience, no matter how much they might want them." Kimmel leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of having finally cracked the facade. "But isn't that exactly the problem? You've decided what belongs to the audience and what doesn't. You've appointed yourself the gatekeeper of your own authenticity. And what you've chosen to give them is this sanitized, safe version of Steve Martin that doesn't really exist." "Of course it exists," Martin shot back, his voice rising to a level that made several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "It exists because I created it. It exists because I chose to emphasize the parts of myself that bring joy instead of the parts that bring pain. It exists because I decided, a long time ago, that if I was going to ask people to spend their time and money on me, I was going to give them something that made their lives better, not worse. But what about your life, Steve? What about making your life better? Don't you think that maybe, just maybe, all this careful curation, all this emotional management, all this refusal to let anyone see you struggle might be making you smaller instead of bigger, might be cutting you off from the very connections that make life worth living?" Martin stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, staring at Kimmel with an expression that cycled through anger, disgust, and something that looked almost like grief. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute finality. "You want to know what makes life worth living, Jimmy? Respect, dignity, the ability to make choices about how you present yourself to the world, the right to keep some parts of yourself private, the freedom to decide that not every moment of your existence needs to be examined, analyzed, and packaged for consumption. What you're doing right now, This isn't connection. This is violation. Violation. Kimmel's voice took on a mocking tone. That made several people in the audience wince. Steve, you're on a talk show. You agreed to be here. You knew there would be questions. If you can't handle a conversation that goes a little deeper than your usual promotional circuit, maybe you shouldn't be here. You're absolutely right, Martin said, his voice suddenly calm in a way that was somehow more frightening than his. Anger had been, I shouldn't be here. Not with you. Not like this. Not ever again. He began to remove his microphone, his movements deliberate and final. Kimmel, sensing that he was losing control of the situation, tried to regain the upper hand. Oh, come on, Steve, don't be so dramatic. We're just talking. This is what conversation looks like when people stop pretending everything is perfect. All the time. This is what honesty feels like. Martin paused in his movements, microphone halfway off, and looked directly into Kimmel's eyes. No, Jimmy, this is what cruelty feels like. This is what it looks like when someone decides that their entertainment is more important than another person's humanity. This is what happens when a host forgets that their job is to make guests feel welcome, not to make them feel like specimens under a microscope. But isn't that exactly what you do to your audiences? Kimmel shot back desperately, clearly realizing that his grand experiment was falling apart. Don't you put them under a microscope. Don't you analyze their reactions, study their laughter, calculate exactly what will get the biggest response. Martin finally removed his microphone completely and set it carefully on the small table beside his chair. The difference, Jimmy, is that my audience chooses to be there. They buy tickets, they know what they're getting, they come because they want to be part of something joyful. They leave because they enjoyed themselves. You, on the other hand, you lied to me. You pretended this was going to be a normal interview, and instead, you turned it into an ambush. You used your platform, your audience, your power as a host to try to humiliate me for your own entertainment. I'm trying to give the audience something real, Kimmel protested, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. I'm trying to show them that celebrities are human beings with real problems and real struggles, just like everyone else. No, Martin said, standing up and straightening his jacket with the careful precision of a man who had spent his entire career maintaining his dignity under pressure. You're trying to show them that you have the power to tear down someone they respect. You're trying to prove that you can get to me, that you can crack the code, that you can be the guy who finally breaks Steve Martin. Well, congratulations, Jimmy. You got your moment. You got your viral clip. You got your proof that even people who have spent their entire careers being professional and respectful have a breaking point. The studio was completely silent now. The audience, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be talked about for years to come. Kimmel, for the first time since the interview began, seemed to realize that he had gone too far. Steve, look, maybe we got off track here. Maybe we can start over. Talk about your book, keep things light. Martin looked at him with something that might have been pity. Jimmy, you don't get to decide when this is over. You don't get to push someone to their breaking point and then casually suggest that we start over like nothing happened. You made your choice when you decided to turn this interview into a psychological experiment. Now I'm making mine. He walked toward the edge of the stage, leaving Kimmel sitting alone at his desk, the weight of what had just happened settling over the studio like a heavy blanket. As he reached the curtain, Martin turned back one final time. You know what the saddest part of all this is, Jimmy? You actually had a chance to have a real conversation with me tonight. If you had approached this with respect, with genuine curiosity, instead of manufactured controversy, if you had asked me real questions, instead of trying to tear me down, you might have learned something. We both might have learned something. But instead, you chose to make this about power, about proving that you could get to me. Well, you did, and now everyone gets to see what that looks like. With that, Steve Martin walked off the Jimmy Kimmel live stage, leaving behind a stunned audience, a speechless host, and a moment that would forever change how people thought about the relationship between celebrities and the shows that claimed to celebrate them. So there you have it, one of the most shocking moments in late-night television history. A legendary performer pushed beyond his breaking point by a host who seemed more interested in creating controversy than conducting a respectful interview. What do you think? Was Jimmy Kimmel trying to create compelling television, or did he cross a line that should never be crossed? Drop a comment below and let me know which late-night host you think shows the most respect for their guests. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more stories from the world of entertainment that you won't hear anywhere else.